Wyoming Territory, 1875. As the autumn sun dipped behind the Teton Range, Dulaine Michaels stood on the weathered porch of the Lazy M Ranch house, staring into the distance where trouble always seemed to lurk. At 26, he'd already spent more years than he cared to count fighting the unforgiving frontier, and it had taught him one brutal truth: love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, not when survival demanded everything you had. He tugged his worn leather gloves tighter and squinted at the horizon. 3 years since he'd inherited this spread from his uncle, and every season brought new threats: rustlers, drought, blizzards that could kill a man in hours. The ranch consumed his every waking moment, leaving no room for the softness other men indulged in. Marriage and family were liabilities out here, distractions that got men killed. He'd seen it happen too many times. "Boss," his foreman's voice carried across the yard. "Stage is coming in, might be that Eastern girl your sister wrote about." Dulaine cursed under his breath. His sister Emmeline's latest well-intentioned meddling, convincing some city woman to come teach at the settlement's makeshift school, was the last complication he needed. Another helpless Easterner who'd take one look at the harsh realities of Wyoming and flee back to civilization, leaving everyone disappointed. Again, "Better saddle up," he called back, resignation heavy in his voice. "Can't have some city woman stranded at the station." The 10-mile ride to the stage depot gave Dulaine plenty of time to rehearse his speech, the one about how the territory wasn't for everyone, how there'd be no shame in taking the next stage back east. He delivered it 3 times to would-be schoolteachers in the past year alone. Women with soft hands and starry-eyed notions of frontier romance who crumbled when faced with the brutal reality of territorial life. The stagecoach had already arrived when Dulaine reined in his chestnut gelding at the station. 2 drummers were collecting their sample cases, arguing over the best route to Cheyenne. The driver was tossing down luggage. And standing alone beside a single trunk and a small valise was a young woman in a travel-worn navy blue dress who couldn't have been more than 22. Charlotte Delaney clasped her gloved hands tightly before her as she surveyed the tiny collection of weathered buildings that comprised the stage stop. After 4 days of bruising travel, she'd arrived in what felt like the edge of civilization itself. The vast openness of the territory stretched in every direction, making her feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. She tucked a loose strand of honey-blonde hair back into her once neat bun, attempting to compose herself despite the exhaustion seeping through her bones. At 20 years old, she'd left behind everything familiar: her father's modest home in Boston, the comfort of gaslit streets, the predictability of society. All for a teaching position in a place where she knew not a soul save for a kindly letter writer named Dulaine Michaels, who'd promised her a position of respect and purpose. "Miss Delaney," a deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Charlotte turned to find herself looking up quite a ways up, into the most strikingly intense blue eyes she'd ever encountered. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face bronzed by the sun but still youthful beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't smiling. "Yes, I'm Charlotte Delaney." She extended her hand in greeting. "You must be Mr. Michaels. Your sister described you in her letters." For a moment, Dulaine simply looked at her outstretched hand. Then, with a reluctance she could feel, he removed his glove and took her fingers briefly in his calloused palm. "Dulaine Michaels, I own the Lazy M." He dropped her hand quickly. "My sister's waiting at the ranch. It's another 10 miles. Can you ride?" Charlotte swallowed hard. "I am afraid I've never had occasion to learn properly." She gestured to her trunk. "I brought some riding skirts though, Mrs. Michaels suggested I would need them." Something like resignation crossed his features. "Stage won't be back through for 3 days. You can ride double with me." Before Charlotte could process what that meant, he tossed her valise to the station keeper for safekeeping, instructed the man to hold her trunk until he could return with a wagon, and was guiding her toward his horse. "We'll lose daylight if we don't start now," he said, impatience edging his tone. "Put your foot in my hands and I'll boost you up." Charlotte hesitated only a moment before gathering her skirts and doing as instructed. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her with surprising ease, settling her sideways on the saddle. Before she could adjust her position, he swung up behind her with fluid grace, one arm reaching around her to take the reins. "Hold onto the pommel," he instructed, his voice close to her ear, "and lean back against me if you need to balance." The impropriety of their position wasn't lost on Charlotte, but frontier necessity clearly superseded Boston propriety. As the horse began to move, she found herself instinctively leaning back against the solid wall of his chest, her heart racing at the unfamiliar intimacy. They rode in silence for several miles, the rhythm of the horse's gait gradually becoming less terrifying as Charlotte adjusted to the sensation. The vastness of the landscape was overwhelming, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush stretching to distant mountains that seemed painted against the sky. "It's beautiful," she said finally, unable to contain her awe despite her companion's stoic silence. "It'll kill you if you don't respect it," Dulaine replied flatly. "Weather changes in minutes, winters that freeze men solid. Summers that parch everything to dust. Indians still raid sometimes, though less than before, and there's always rustlers looking to steal what honest men work for." Charlotte turned slightly to glance at his profile. "Your sister mentioned challenges, but she also spoke of community, of good people making a life here. My sister sees the best in everything. It's not a trait that serves well out here." He adjusted his arm, careful to maintain a proper distance despite their forced proximity. "Miss Delaney, I don't know what Emmeline promised you, but—" "She promised nothing beyond honest work teaching children who need education," Charlotte interrupted. "And a room in your ranch house until proper teachers' accommodations can be arranged in town." "And you left Boston for that?" Disbelief colored his tone. Charlotte faced forward again, her shoulders straightening. "I left Boston because there was nothing keeping me there. My father passed last winter. Teaching positions are scarce for women without connections. When your sister's advertisement appeared in the Gazette, it seemed providential." The wind carried her words away, and for several minutes only the sound of the horse's hooves broke the silence between them. "I'm sorry about your father," Dulaine finally said, his voice softer than before. "Thank you." Charlotte was surprised by the genuine sympathy in his tone. "He was a good man, a history professor at the ladies' seminary where I studied. He believed education was the greatest gift one could give. Not much call for history out here. Most folks are concerned with surviving until next season." "All the more reason education matters," Charlotte countered. "Children born into hardship deserve the chance to dream beyond it." Dulaine made a noncommittal sound, but Charlotte sensed he was considering her words. As they crested a rise, he reined in the horse. "There," he said, gesturing toward the valley below, "Lazy M." Charlotte's breath caught at the sight. Nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains lay a collection of buildings, a substantial two-story house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, bunkhouse, corrals, and outbuildings. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and a creek wound through the property like a silver ribbon. "It's larger than I imagined," she admitted. "My uncle built it, started with nothing but a claimed stake and determination. Took him 30 years, pride had entered Dulaine's voice for the first time. "I inherited it when he passed 3 years back." "Your sister mentioned you've expanded since then." "Trying to. Need more grazing land for the herd if we're going to survive the railroad coming through." He nudged the horse forward. "Come on, Emmeline will be worried." As they approached the ranch, Charlotte could see a slender woman in a calico dress waiting on the porch. The moment they rode into the yard, she hurried down the steps, her face alight with welcome. "Charlotte, you've arrived at last," Dulaine Michaels called out, clasping her hands together in delight. "I've been watching the road all afternoon." Dulaine dismounted first, then reached up to help Charlotte down. His hands spanned her waist easily as he lowered her to the ground, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Something indefinable passed between them before he quickly released her and stepped back. "Thank you, Mr. Michaels," Charlotte said softly. He nodded once, then led his horse toward the barn without another word. "Don't mind my brother," Emmeline said, linking her arm through Charlotte's. "He's suspicious of anyone new until they prove themselves. Been that way since our parents died in that influenza outbreak when we were children." "He doesn't seem to approve of my coming here," Charlotte observed as Emmeline guided her toward the house. "Dulaine believes ranching is too hard for women," Emmeline replied with a conspiratorial smile. "I've spent 3 years proving him wrong. Now you'll help me prove that this territory needs education just as much as it needs cattle." She squeezed Charlotte's arm. "He'll come around when he sees you're not some fragile flower ready to blow away in the first Wyoming wind." Charlotte wasn't certain of that as she followed Emmeline into the warmth of the ranch house, but she was determined to try. She hadn't come all this way to fail. The first days at Lazy M passed in a blur of introductions and adjustments. Charlotte discovered that the ranch housed not only Dulaine and Emmeline, but also a cook named Francine, a robust widow from Missouri who ruled the kitchen with an iron ladle, and a rotating cast of cowboys who took their meals at the main house. The bunkhouse sheltered another 8 men who worked the ranch year-round, with more hired during the busy seasons. Emmeline had prepared a comfortable bedroom for Charlotte on the second floor, with a small sitting area where she could prepare lessons. The settlement's makeshift school, she learned, was currently closed following the previous teacher's hasty departure after a particularly harsh winter. Classes won't start until after harvest anyway, Emmeline explained as she showed Charlotte around the ranch. The children are all helping their families with fall work, but that gives you time to settle in and prepare. Dulaine remained a distant figure, leaving before dawn each morning and often returning after supper was cleared away. When their paths did cross, his interactions with Charlotte were unfailingly polite but brief, as though he were simply waiting for her inevitable departure. On her fourth morning, Charlotte rose before sunrise, determined to prove her usefulness while waiting for the school term to begin. She found Francine already working in the kitchen and offered to help with breakfast. "Biscuits need kneading," the cook said, appraising Charlotte's willingness with approval. "You know how to make a decent biscuit, city girl." "My father and I kept no servants," Charlotte replied, rolling up her sleeves. "I may not know ranch work, but I'm familiar with a kitchen." By the time the ranch hands began filing in for breakfast, Charlotte had helped prepare a hearty meal of biscuits, gravy, eggs, and bacon. She found herself enjoying the easy camaraderie of the cowboys, most of whom treated her with a careful respect tinged with curiosity. Dulaine arrived last, pausing momentarily in the doorway when he spotted Charlotte serving coffee alongside Francine. Their eyes met briefly before he took his seat at the head of the table. "Miss Delaney," he acknowledged with a nod. "Mr. Michaels," she returned evenly, pouring his coffee. "I trust you slept well." A ripple of poorly concealed amusement passed through the assembled cowboys at her formal address. Dulaine's expression remained unchanged. "Well enough, you're up early." "I believe in earning my keep, Mr. Michaels." Something that might have been approval flickered across his features before he turned his attention to his plate. Charlotte continued her duties, aware of his occasional glance in her direction. After breakfast, as the men filed out to begin their day's work, Dulaine lingered behind. Charlotte was collecting plates when he approached her. "Miss Delaney, I'm riding out to check the north pasture today. Emmeline mentioned you were interested in seeing more of the ranch." Charlotte couldn't hide her surprise at the invitation. "Yes, I would like that very much. We'll be gone most of the day." "Francine can pack a lunch." His tone was matter-of-fact, but something in his eyes had softened slightly. "Wear your riding skirt, I'll have a gentle mare saddled for you." "I should warn you that my riding experience is limited to the few miles from the stage station," Charlotte admitted. "You'll learn." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Every ranch woman does. An hour later, Charlotte found herself atop a placid bay mare named Blossom, following Dulaine along a well-worn trail that wound through the heart of the Lazy M. Despite her initial nervousness, she quickly discovered a natural affinity for riding, and by mid-morning was feeling confident enough to appreciate the stunning landscape around them. "Your ranch is even more beautiful than I imagined," she said as they paused to water the horses at a small stream. "How many acres do you have?" 8,000 deeded, Dulaine replied, dismounting to check his horse's hooves. "And grazing rights to another 5,000 of government land. Not nearly enough if I'm going to build the herd to where it needs to be." "Is that why you work such long hours?" "To expand." He straightened, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. "This land demands everything you have and then asks for more. The moment you start taking it for granted is the moment it destroys you." "That sounds like a lonely philosophy, Mr. Michaels." "It's a realistic one." He helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "And out here, you might as well call me Dulaine." "Mister is for towns and strangers." "Then you must call me Charlotte," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither acknowledged. Then Dulaine released her and turned away, leading the horses to drink from the stream. They continued their ride through rolling pastureland dotted with grazing cattle, Dulaine pointing out landmarks and explaining the operation of the ranch. Charlotte found herself captivated not only by the landscape, but by the gradual animation in her companion as he spoke about the land he clearly loved. "My uncle used to say that ranching gets in your blood," he told her as they shared the lunch Francine had packed. They sat beneath a lone cottonwood tree, the horses grazing nearby. "I never understood what he meant until my first cattle drive. 17, green as spring grass, convinced I knew everything. By the end I was bruised, exhausted, and somehow changed." "Changed how?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious about this glimpse into the man behind the stern exterior. Dulaine considered her question, his gaze distant. I realize that everything that matters can be lost in an instant out here. One mistake, one moment of inattention, but there's a purity in that, no pretense. No hiding behind social niceties. That sounds both terrifying and liberating, Charlotte observed, his eyes refocused on her, surprise evident. Most Eastern women would only hear the terror. Perhaps I'm not most women, she replied simply. A sudden shout interrupted their conversation. One of Dulaine's cowboys was galloping toward them, his horse lathered with exertion. Boss, he called, reining in hard. Rustlers hit the East Range, drove off maybe 30 head. Jackson's trailing them, but they're headed for the Badlands. Dulaine was on his feet instantly, all trace of relaxation vanished. How many? 4, maybe 5, armed. Get back to the ranch. Tell Hank to gather 6 men and meet me at Bear Creek Pass. They'll try to push through there before dark. He turned to Charlotte, his expression grim. I need to get you back to the ranch. No, Charlotte said, rising quickly. You need to go now, I can find my way back. The trail is clear and Blossom knows her way home. Uncertainty crossed his features. It's 5 miles, you've never ridden alone. And I never will if someone always escorts me, she countered firmly. Go, your cattle are more important than my comfort. For a heartbeat, Dulaine hesitated, clearly torn, then he nodded once sharply. Follow this trail exactly, don't deviate. If you're not back in 2 hours, Emmeline will send someone to look for you. He mounted in one fluid motion, then locked eyes with her. Be careful, Charlotte. You as well, Dulaine. She watched him gallop away with his cowhand, dust billowing behind them. Only when they disappeared from sight did she allow herself to feel the tremor of nervousness at the prospect of riding back alone. But determination quickly overcame fear. If she was to belong in this place, she must learn its ways. The ride back proved less daunting than she'd feared. Blossom was indeed familiar with the trail, and Charlotte found herself relaxing enough to appreciate the solitude and beauty around her. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, she felt a surprising sense of accomplishment and concern for Dulaine and his men facing armed rustlers. Emmeline rushed from the house as Charlotte rode into the yard. Thank goodness. Walter told us what happened. Are you all right riding back alone? I'm fine, Charlotte assured her, dismounting with only slight stiffness. But I'm worried about your brother and the others. Dulaine's been facing down rustlers since he was 20, Emmeline said, though concern lined her face. He knows these hills better than anyone. Nevertheless, dinner was a tense affair, with Emmeline frequently glancing toward the windows as darkness fell. When hoofbeats finally sounded in the yard past 9 o'clock, both women hurried to the porch. Dulaine dismounted wearily, his face smudged with dirt and what looked distressingly like blood along one sleeve. Behind him, his men were leading several recovered cattle into the corral. Are you hurt? Charlotte asked before she could stop herself, stepping forward with alarm evident in her voice. He looked up, seeming surprised to find her waiting. Not mine. One of the rustlers got himself shot when they decided to fight instead of surrender. Did you? She couldn't quite finish the question. No, his expression hardened, but I wouldn't have hesitated if necessary. They threatened my men and stole my cattle. Out here, that's asking for a pine box. The harshness of frontier justice struck Charlotte anew, but she could see the exhaustion beneath his stern words. You must be hungry. I'll have Francine warm a plate for you. Gratitude flickered briefly in his eyes. Thank you, I need to check on the men first. Later, as Charlotte set a steaming plate before him in the otherwise empty kitchen, she noticed how he winced slightly when reaching for his coffee. You are hurt, she accused gently. Let me see. It's nothing, caught a branch during the chase. But he didn't resist when she moved behind his chair and carefully rolled up his sleeve. A jagged cut ran along his forearm, not deep but angry-looking. Charlotte retrieved the medical kit Emmeline had shown her during her orientation to the house and set about cleaning the wound. You rode back alone, Dulaine said as she worked, his voice low. Emmeline said you arrived calm as could be. I had an excellent teacher this morning, Charlotte replied, concentrating on bandaging his arm properly. And a very reliable horse. Most city women would have panicked. She tied off the bandage and met his gaze directly. Perhaps it's time you stopped expecting me to behave like most city women, Dulaine. For the first time since she'd arrived, a genuine smile transformed his features. It was brief but revealed a glimpse of the man he might be without the weight of responsibility he carried. Perhaps it is, Charlotte, he agreed softly. As the days stretched into weeks, Charlotte found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. Mornings were spent helping with household chores and preparing lessons for the upcoming school term. Afternoons often found her exploring the ranch on horseback, sometimes alone and sometimes accompanied by Emmeline or one of the hands Dulaine assigned as escort when she ventured further afield. Dulaine himself remained largely occupied with ranch business, but Charlotte noticed a gradual shift in their interactions. The initial cool politeness had given way to a cautious respect, punctuated by moments of unexpected connection, a shared observation over breakfast, a brief exchange about a book she'd found in his small library, a comment on her improving writing skills. October brought the first dusting of snow to the high country and final preparations for winter. Charlotte had begun holding informal lessons for 3 ranch children whose families worked for Dulaine, using the ranch house dining room after breakfast. One morning, she looked up from explaining basic arithmetic to find Dulaine leaning against the doorframe, watching the lesson with an unreadable expression. When the children had been dismissed to their chores, he approached her as she gathered her teaching materials. "You're good with them," he observed, helping her stack the slate boards. "Even Tucker and that boy's never sat still for anything in his life." Charlotte smiled, pleased by the compliment. Children respond to being taken seriously. "Tucker has a quick mind, he just needs direction for all that energy. The settlement school board meets tomorrow. They'll want to meet you before formally offering the teaching position." His fingers brushed hers as he handed her the last slate. "I'll drive you into town." "Thank you, I've been looking forward to seeing more of the community." Charlotte hesitated, then added, "Will I be moving to town once the position is confirmed?" "Your sister mentioned teachers' accommodations were being arranged." Something flickered across Dulaine's face, displeasure, concern, before his expression neutralized. "The teacherage isn't finished. Construction stopped when the last teacher left. It would be better for you to continue staying here through winter at least." "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition." His response came quickly, almost sharply, then more measured. "The ranch is closer to the outlying families anyway. Makes more sense for the school to be here until spring." Before Charlotte could respond, one of the ranch hands burst into the house, his expression urgent. "Boss, stampede in the south pasture." Lightning spooked the herd during that squall. Dulaine was immediately in motion. "Get the men, I want everyone who can ride." He glanced at Charlotte, conflict evident. "I'm sorry." "Go," she urged. "I understand." He paused only long enough to hold her gaze for a moment before rushing out. Through the window, Charlotte watched him vault onto his horse and gallop away, the other men falling in behind him. An unexpected pang of worry twisted in her chest, a feeling that had become increasingly familiar whenever Dulaine faced danger. The day stretched endlessly as Charlotte helped Francine prepare extra food for the men who would return exhausted and hungry. A steady rain had begun falling, adding to her concern. When hoofbeats finally sounded in the yard after nightfall, she found herself hurrying to the door alongside Emmeline. The scene that greeted them was one of muddy exhaustion. The men dismounted wearily, leading horses that looked as drained as their riders. Dulaine came last, his expression grim as he spoke quietly to his foreman. His clothes were soaked through, mud splattered to his thighs, his face etched with fatigue. "3 dead that we've found," he reported when Emmeline asked about the cattle. "Might find more tomorrow. Managed to keep most of the herd from reaching the ravine, at least." As the hands filed toward the bunkhouse and hot food, Dulaine headed for the barn to see to his horse. Charlotte found herself following him, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. She found him methodically unsaddling his exhausted mount, his movements stiff with cold and fatigue. "You should get warm and dry," she said softly from the barn doorway. "I can finish this." Dulaine looked up, clearly surprised to find her there. "You don't need to." "I know," she stepped forward, gently taking the brush from his hand. "But I want to help." For a moment, he seemed about to refuse. Then something in his expression yielded and he stepped back, allowing her to take over grooming his horse while he removed the saddle. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the rain on the barn roof and the occasional soft nickering of the horses. Charlotte had learned basic horse care during her weeks at the ranch and found the rhythmic brushing soothing. When she finished, she turned to find Dulaine watching her, an unfamiliar softness in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "You're shivering," she observed, noticing how his wet shirt clung to him. "You need to get inside." "Been wet before." "Won't be the last time." but he didn't resist when she took his arm and led him toward the house. In the warmth of the kitchen, Charlotte insisted on bringing him a hot meal while he changed into dry clothes. When he returned, he found her waiting with a steaming plate and coffee. "The men are all accounted for?" she asked as he sat heavily in the chair she'd pulled close to the fire. Dulaine nodded, accepting the food gratefully. "No injuries except bruises. Could have been much worse if the herd had reached the ravine." "You saved them because you know this land," Charlotte said, "because you respect what it can do." He looked up at her, something like surprise crossing his features. "Yes. You told me that on our first ride together, that the land demands everything and destroys those who take it for granted." She sat in the chair opposite him, the firelight casting warm shadows across her face. "I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant." Dulaine studied her for a long moment. "Most people never do." "I'm not most people," she smiled slightly, "as I believe I've mentioned before." The corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile she'd come to treasure. "No, Charlotte. You're definitely not." The following day dawned clear, the overnight rain having washed the world clean. Despite his exhaustion, Dulaine was true to his word about taking Charlotte to town for the school board meeting. They set out mid-morning in the ranch wagon, the 10-mile journey passing pleasantly as Charlotte peppered him with questions about the families whose children would be in her care. Willow Creek proved to be a small but growing settlement, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings including a general store, saloon, small hotel, livery, and a few other establishments. At the far end stood a modest white-painted church and beside it a small schoolhouse. "It's not much," Dulaine said as he helped Charlotte down from the wagon, "but it's growing. The railroad survey crew says the line will likely come through within 2 years." "It's charming," Charlotte replied honestly, adjusting her bonnet as she took in the bustling activity along the street. "And clearly thriving." Dulaine led her to the general store, where the school board was assembled, 3 men and 2 women representing the settlement's leading families. Charlotte found herself subjected to a thorough but polite interrogation about her qualifications, teaching philosophy, and readiness for frontier life. Through it all, Dulaine remained a steady presence at her side, occasionally interjecting with relevant information about the accommodations at the ranch. "Well, Miss Delaney," said Mr. Peterson, the board chairman, when the questions had finally ceased, "I believe I speak for all of us when I say we would be delighted to have you take charge of our school. Term starts first Monday of November and runs through March, with a break for Christmas, then again from April through June." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I'm honored to accept the position," Charlotte replied, a surge of accomplishment warming her. This was why she'd come west, to build something meaningful, to contribute. "Michaels tells us you'll be staying out at the Lazy M for the time being," Mrs. Hammond, the minister's wife, added with a meaningful glance between Charlotte and Dulaine. "We'll work on getting the teacherage habitable by spring." Charlotte felt herself blush slightly at the woman's implication. "The Michaels family has been very gracious to offer accommodation while I settle in." "My sister appreciates having another woman at the ranch," Dulaine added, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. "And it's convenient for the outlying families who can't easily bring their children to town daily." The meeting concluded with handshakes all around and an invitation to stay for lunch at the hotel dining room, which Dulaine accepted on their behalf. As they walked down the boardwalk, Charlotte found herself uncomfortably aware of the speculative glances cast their way by townspeople. "They're curious about you," Dulaine explained, correctly interpreting her discomfort. "New faces are still noteworthy here, especially unattached young women." "And my staying at your ranch only adds to the speculation," Charlotte concluded quietly. Dulaine's expression darkened. "Frontier gossip, ignore it. Anyone who matters knows my sister is a proper chaperone." The meal proved pleasant despite Charlotte's awareness of curious eyes. The hotel dining room served surprisingly good food, and she found herself relaxing as Dulaine pointed out various town notables and shared the settlement's history. "My uncle helped found this town," he explained as they lingered over coffee. "Said every decent community needed 3 things: a church, a school, and a place where a man could get a proper haircut." Charlotte laughed, delighted by this glimpse of family history. "Is there a barber shop then?" "Old Samuel runs it next to the livery. Worst haircuts west of the Mississippi, but he was the only one willing to set up shop here in '68, so he's something of an institution." Dulaine's expression had softened, his usual guardedness temporarily lowered. You love this place, Charlotte observed, not just the ranch but the whole community. He seemed startled by her perception, then nodded slowly. It's all I've ever known. All I've ever wanted to know, even though it demands everything from you. Maybe because of that, his eyes met hers across the table. What about you, Charlotte? What made you leave everything familiar to come to a place that promises only hardship? The directness of his question surprised her, but she found herself answering with equal candor. After my father died, I realized I'd been living in a waiting room, not truly experiencing life, just preparing for it, teaching at a proper Boston school, eventually marrying a suitable man, living exactly the life expected of me. She traced the rim of her coffee cup. When your sister's letter arrived seeking a teacher, it felt like an invitation to step out of the waiting room and into the world. And now that you're here, is the world what you expected? It's harder, she admitted, and more beautiful. More real. Something shifted in Dulaine's gaze, a warming that made Charlotte's heart beat faster. Before he could respond, however, the hotel proprietor approached their table. Michaels, telegram came for you this morning. He handed over a yellow paper. Figured you'd be in town today for the board meeting. Dulaine's expression changed instantly as he read the message, his jaw tightening. Thank you, James. Tell Harris I'll be by the telegraph office before we leave. Trouble? Charlotte asked when the man had departed. Cattle buyer from Chicago, coming to inspect the herd earlier than expected. He folded the telegram and tucked it into his vest pocket. Means we need to push the drive to the winter pasture sooner than planned. Just like that, the brief moment of connection was overshadowed by the constant demands of the ranch. Charlotte felt a pang of disappointment but understood this was the reality of the life Dulaine led, the responsibilities that defined him. The drive back to the ranch was quieter, Dulaine clearly preoccupied with the logistical challenges presented by the buyer's early arrival. When they arrived, he helped Charlotte down from the wagon, his touch brisk and impersonal. I need to meet with the foreman. Please tell Emmeline I'll miss supper. He was already turning away, his mind elsewhere. Dulaine, Charlotte called after him, something in her unwilling to let him retreat completely into his work. When he paused and looked back, she smiled gently. Thank you for today. For supporting my position with the board. For a moment, the preoccupation in his eyes cleared and he seemed truly present again. You earned it yourself, Charlotte. I just made sure they knew what they'd be foolish to lose. With that, he strode toward the bunkhouse, leaving Charlotte with a warm feeling despite the autumn chill in the air. The next week passed in a flurry of activity as the ranch prepared for both the early cattle drive and the beginning of the school term. Charlotte found herself swept up in the preparations, helping Francine pack supplies for the men who would be moving nearly 2,000 head of cattle to winter pasture 30 miles south. She also worked feverishly to prepare the dining room as a temporary classroom, arranging benches and tables borrowed from the bunkhouse. Dulaine was a scarce presence, leaving before dawn and returning late, often after Charlotte had retired for the night. On the rare occasions their paths crossed, he was unfailingly polite but distant, his mind clearly consumed with the impending drive and buyer visit. The night before the men were to leave with the herd, Charlotte was sitting by the fire in the main room, mending a tear in one of her teaching skirts when Dulaine entered. He looked exhausted, his face showing the strain of the past days, but he paused when he saw her. You should be resting, she said. You've been working from dawn until well past dusk all week. Too much to organize. He removed his hat, running a hand through hair that was becoming too long. We leave at first light. How long will you be gone? Charlotte set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. 4 days to move the herd, then however long the buyer needs to inspect. A week, maybe more. He hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite her. Will you be all right here with school starting? The question surprised her, not the concern itself, but that he would voice it despite his preoccupation. We'll manage perfectly well. Emmeline has been wonderful and the children seem eager to begin. Dulaine nodded, his gaze drawn to the fire. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken thoughts. I worry, he said finally, his voice low, about leaving the ranch, about what might happen while I'm gone. Charlotte understood instinctively that this admission cost him something, that Dulaine Michaels was not a man who easily confessed vulnerability. The ranch will still be here when you return, she said softly, as will everyone in it. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I've never had much to come back to before, just land and livestock. A pause heavy with meaning. It feels different now. The implication in his words sent a flutter through Charlotte's chest. Before she could respond, Emmeline entered from the kitchen, carrying a tray. I thought you might want coffee before— Oh, she stopped, looking between them with evident surprise. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not, Dulaine said quickly, rising from his chair. I was just heading up. Early start tomorrow. He nodded once to Charlotte, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than any words might have, then disappeared up the stairs. Emmeline set down her tray and raised an eyebrow at Charlotte. Did I truly interrupt something? Charlotte smoothed her skirt, trying to collect her suddenly scattered thoughts. Just conversation. Emmeline's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced. My brother hasn't just conversed with a woman since Clara Jenkins set her cap for him 3 years ago and nearly trapped him into a proposal before he discovered she was more interested in the ranch than the rancher. I'm sure I don't know what you're implying, Charlotte protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. I'm implying nothing. Emmeline sat in the chair Dulaine had vacated. I'm stating plainly that my brother looks at you differently than he's looked at anyone in a very long time. And I'm not the only one who's noticed. Charlotte's heart skipped at this confirmation of what she'd begun to suspect, and hope might be developing between herself and Dulaine, but doubt quickly followed. He's been nothing but properly respectful, she said carefully, and I'm an employee of the school board, a guest in your home. Charlotte, Emmeline leaned forward, her expression earnest. Out here, we don't have the luxury of moving at society's prescribed pace. Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste on unnecessary hesitation. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that when my brother returns, you might consider being honest about your feelings, whatever they may be. She patted Charlotte's hand and rose. Now I believe I'll take this coffee upstairs myself. Good night, dear. Charlotte remained by the fire long after Emmeline had gone, her thoughts in turmoil. Was she developing feelings for Dulaine Michaels? Undeniably. The man's quiet strength, his devotion to his land and people, his rare but transformative smiles, all had worked their way beneath her carefully constructed composure. But was she ready to acknowledge such feelings, to act on them? This wasn't Boston, where courtship followed prescribed rules over months or years. As Emmeline had said, the frontier demanded honesty, sometimes brutal honesty, about what mattered. And Dulaine Michaels, Charlotte was beginning to realize, mattered a great deal. The cattle drive departed in pre-dawn darkness, Dulaine leading 20 men and nearly 2,000 head toward winter pasture. Charlotte watched from her bedroom window as the procession of riders disappeared into the misty half-light, her heart following long after they'd vanished from sight. School began that same morning, with 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 gathering in the ranch house dining room. Charlotte threw herself into teaching, finding genuine joy in the eager minds before her despite their varied levels of education. These children, she discovered, possessed a practical intelligence and work ethic that many of her Boston pupils had lacked, making up for gaps in formal learning with resourcefulness and determination. The days fell into a pleasant rhythm, teaching during morning hours, helping with ranch chores in the afternoon, and preparing lessons in the evening. Emmeline proved an invaluable support, assisting with the younger children and helping Charlotte understand the community dynamics that influenced her classroom. 5 days after the drive departed, a sudden snowstorm blew in from the mountains, dropping 8 inches of heavy, wet snow in less than 24 hours. Charlotte awoke to a transformed landscape, the familiar ranch buildings softened under white blankets, trees bowed with the weight of snow on their branches. No school today, Emmeline announced at breakfast. The outlying families won't be able to make it through the drifts. Will the storm affect the cattle drive? Charlotte couldn't keep the concern from her voice. Dulaine would have moved them to the sheltered valley before the weather hit, Emmeline assured her. He can read the sky better than most men read books. Nevertheless, Charlotte found herself periodically glancing out windows throughout the day, watching as the snow continued to fall in fitful bursts. By evening, her concern had deepened to genuine worry. They should have been back by now, shouldn't they? She asked as she helped Emmeline prepare supper. If they left the herd 4 days ago. Travel will be slow in the snow, Emmeline replied, though Charlotte noticed she'd been checking the window regularly as well. And the buyer might have delayed them. A pounding at the kitchen door startled both women. Emmeline hurried to open it, revealing one of the younger ranch hands, snow-covered and stamping his boots. Miss Emmeline, he panted, riders coming in, looks like the boss and some of the men. Charlotte's heart leaped with relief, only to plummet again at the concern in the young man's voice. Something's wrong, Emmeline said, already reaching for her shawl. They're riding too hard for this weather." Charlotte followed her onto the porch, straining to see through the gathering twilight. A group of riders was indeed approaching, pushing their horses faster than was safe on the snow-covered ground. As they drew closer, Charlotte could make out Dulaine in the lead, another man slumped before him in the saddle. "Get Francine to heat water," Emmeline ordered, hurrying down the steps, "and bring all the clean linens from the upstairs press." By the time Charlotte had delivered these instructions and returned to the porch, the riders had reached the yard. Dulaine was carefully lowering the injured man into waiting arms, his own movements betraying exhaustion. "Ambushed 6 miles south," she heard him telling Emmeline as she approached. "3 men, waiting where the trail narrows through the rocks. Shot Peterson before we knew what was happening." "The buyer?" Emmeline asked, helping direct the wounded man toward the house. "Safe at winter camp with half the crew. We left after the papers were signed." Dulaine finally spotted Charlotte hovering uncertainly nearby. Something in his expression shifted, relief perhaps, or simple recognition. "Charlotte." "You're hurt," she said, noticing for the first time the dark stain on his left sleeve. "Bullet grazed me." "Nothing serious." He dismounted stiffly, grimacing as the movement pulled at the wound. "Peterson took the worst of it." "Come inside," Charlotte said, moving to his side. "You need that arm tended to." For once, Dulaine didn't argue. He allowed her to lead him into the house, where organized chaos had erupted as Francine and Emmeline prepared to treat the seriously wounded Peterson. Charlotte guided Dulaine to the kitchen, away from the main activity, and helped him remove his coat and roll up his sleeve. The wound was indeed a graze rather than a penetrating injury, but it had bled freely and looked angry against his skin. Charlotte worked silently, cleaning the wound with warm water and whiskey, her touch gentle despite her racing thoughts. "You could have been killed," she said finally, securing a clean bandage around his arm. "Hazard of the territory." His voice was flat, but when she looked up, his eyes were watching her intently. "I'm more concerned about who knew to ambush us there. Byer's visit wasn't common knowledge. You think someone deliberately targeted you, why?" "Money," Dulaine's expression hardened. "Cattle payment was substantial, and there are those who'd prefer the lazy M failed. Rival ranchers." He shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled at his wound. Could be ordinary thieves who got lucky. Peterson interrupted their shot at me, or I wouldn't be sitting here." The casual acknowledgement of how close he'd come to death sent a chill through Charlotte. She finished tying the bandage in silence, trying to master the surge of emotion his words had triggered. "Thank you," he said quietly when she'd finished, his hand covering hers where it rested on the table. "For this. For being here." The simple touch sent warmth spreading up Charlotte's arm, a counterpoint to the fear still lingering in her chest. "Where else would I be?" His fingers tightened slightly on hers. Many would have fled back east by now. Winter coming on, violence, isolation. "I'm not many," she reminded him, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," he agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're just one. One woman who somehow makes this harsh place feel like." A commotion from the front room interrupted whatever he might have said. Emmeline appeared in the doorway, her apron stained with blood. "Peterson's asking for you," she told Dulaine. "He's fading fast." Dulaine rose immediately, releasing Charlotte's hand. "I'll be right there." He paused, looking back at her with an expression that contained both regret and promise. "We'll finish this conversation." Charlotte nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. Peterson died shortly before midnight, never regaining enough strength to say more than a few broken sentences to Dulaine. Charlotte stayed awake with Emmeline, preparing the body as best they could while Dulaine and the men gathered in somber conference in the bunkhouse. Dawn was breaking when Dulaine finally returned to the house, his face lined with exhaustion and grief. "We'll bury him tomorrow," he told them, accepting the coffee Emmeline pressed into his hands. "His family should be notified first." "I'll write the letter," Emmeline offered. "You need to rest, Dulaine." He shook his head. "No time. Sheriff needs to be informed, and we need to figure out who was behind the ambush." "The sheriff can wait a few hours," Charlotte said firmly. "You've been riding for days, you're wounded, and you've lost a man. Even you need sleep, Dulaine." He looked as though he might argue, but the fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. "Maybe a few hours," he conceded. Charlotte and Emmeline exchanged a glance of shared concern as he trudged heavily up the stairs. They both knew how deeply he would feel the loss of one of his men, and how heavily he would place the blame on his own shoulders. The next days passed in a blur of grim activity. Peterson was buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the ranch, with the entire household and many neighbors in attendance. School resumed, though Charlotte found it difficult to focus on lessons with the pall of recent violence hanging over the ranch. Dulaine disappeared to town with two of his most trusted men, returning with news that the sheriff was organizing a search for the ambushers. Through it all, the promised conversation between Charlotte and Dulaine remained unspoken, pushed aside by the more immediate concerns of death and investigation. She told herself it was for the best, that emotions heightened by danger and proximity might not withstand the return to normal ranch operations. Yet each time their eyes met across the supper table or in passing on the porch, she felt the weight of words unsaid between them. A week after Peterson's funeral, Charlotte was reading by lamplight in her room when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Dulaine standing in the hallway, his expression grave. "I apologize for disturbing you so late," he said formally, "but I wanted to inform you that I'm riding out at first light. We've had word the men who ambushed us have been spotted near the territorial line." Charlotte's heart constricted. "You're going after them yourself?" "With the sheriff and 4 of my men," his eyes were hard, determined. "They killed one of mine. They need to answer for it." "Is vengeance worth risking more lives?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Dulaine's jaw tightened. "It's not vengeance, it's justice and protection. Men who think they can prey on honest ranchers need to learn there's a price." "And if that price is you," Charlotte took a step closer, unable to hide her distress, "what happens to the ranch then, to Emmeline? To everyone who depends on you? Are you suggesting I hide behind my responsibilities, let others fight my battles?" There was a dangerous edge to his voice now. "I'm suggesting that rushing into danger isn't always courage. Sometimes it's pride." Charlotte met his gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "And I'm suggesting that your life matters to more people than you seem to realize." For a long moment they stared at each other, the tension between them almost palpable. Then, to Charlotte's surprise, Dulaine's expression softened. "Including you?" he asked quietly. "Especially me." The admission cost her nothing. It felt like the simplest truth she'd ever spoken. Dulaine took a step forward, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool hallway. His hand rose to brush a strand of hair from her face, the touch feather-light. "I've tried to keep my distance," he said, his voice low. "Told myself you deserved better than a man who might not come home any given day, that you'd realize soon enough this life is too hard, too dangerous, and return east where you belong." "You don't get to decide where I belong," Charlotte replied, her heart hammering in her chest. "That's my choice, and I've made it." Something fierce and hungry flashed in his eyes. "Have you, Charlotte? Because once made, some choices can't be unmade out here." "I know," she swallowed hard, gathering her courage, "and I still choose this place, this life, a breath, you." The last word hung between them for a heartbeat before Dulaine closed the remaining distance, his lips finding hers with a certainty that stole her breath. Charlotte's hands rose to his shoulders as she responded to the kiss with all the emotion she'd been containing for weeks. When they finally broke apart, Dulaine rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I still have to go," he said softly, "but I'll be more careful than I might have been an hour ago." Charlotte nodded, understanding. "Promise me you'll come back." "I promise." He kissed her once more, gently this time. "And when I do, we have much to discuss." She watched him walk away down the hallway, her heart full of both joy and trepidation. In acknowledging their feelings, they had crossed a threshold, but the dangers that had prompted that acknowledgement still loomed. Charlotte slept little that night, her mind filled with both the memory of Dulaine's kiss and fear for what the coming days might bring. At dawn, she rose and dressed quickly, determined to see him off despite the early hour. She found him in the barn, making final preparations to his saddle and gear. He looked up at her approach, his expression warming visibly. "I thought you might still be sleeping," he said. "How could I sleep?" She moved closer, taking in the sight of him as though memorizing his features. "When do you expect to return?" 3 days, 4 at most." He finished checking his cinch and straightened. "Charlotte, about last night." "I meant every word," she interrupted, unwilling to give him space to retreat. "And I'll be here waiting when you return." Relief and something deeper crossed his features. He reached for her hand, enfolding it in both of his. "When I first saw you at that stage station, I thought you were just another Eastern woman who'd flee at the first hardship," he admitted. "I never imagined you'd become essential to this place, to me." Once the cowboy held her hand, she knew she was never leaving the ranch. Charlotte quoted softly, remembering a line from a dime novel she'd read on the stagecoach journey west. I used to think such stories were ridiculous, now I'm not so sure. Dulaine smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Hold that thought until I return, he said, raising her hand to his lips briefly. And remember that I'm keeping my promise. The small party of men rode out as the sun crested the eastern hills, Dulaine raising his hand in a final farewell as they disappeared down the trail. Charlotte stood watching long after they'd vanished from sight, her heart torn between the joy of newfound love and the fear of its loss. The following days were among the longest of Charlotte's life. She threw herself into teaching, finding solace in the children's enthusiasm and the routine of lessons. Evenings were spent with Emmeline, the two women finding comfort in each other's company as they waited for news. On the fourth day, a rider appeared on the horizon, but it was not the returning party. Only a messenger from town with word that Dulaine and the others had crossed into the next territory in pursuit of the ambushers. No estimate was given for their return. He'll be careful, Emmeline assured Charlotte as they sat before the fire that night, their needlework lying forgotten in their laps. He has reason to be now. Charlotte looked up sharply. He told you. A gentle smile, he didn't have to, it's written all over both your faces when you look at each other. Emmeline reached over to squeeze her hand. I'm glad, Charlotte, you're good for him. You see the man beneath the responsibilities. I just hope I have the chance to tell him that, Charlotte said softly. A week after Dulaine's departure, 3 days longer than expected, Charlotte was helping Emmeline inventory the winter preserves when the ranch hand assigned to watch duty burst into the kitchen. Riders coming, he announced. Looks like the boss and the others. Both women dropped what they were doing and hurried outside, straining to see through the bright midday sun. A group of riders was indeed approaching, moving at a steady pace that suggested no injuries. As they drew closer, Charlotte could make out Dulaine in the lead, his familiar posture causing her heart to leap. The men rode into the yard, dust rising around them as they dismounted. Charlotte hung back as ranch hands surrounded them, everyone talking at once, trying to get details of what had happened. Through the crowd, she caught glimpses of Dulaine, tired but whole, responding to questions, directing men to care for the horses. And then suddenly he was before her, having extricated himself from the throng, his eyes finding hers with laser focus. You're back, she said, the simple statement containing worlds of relief. I promised. His voice was rough with exhaustion, but his gaze never wavered. May I speak with you privately? Charlotte nodded, her throat too tight for words. She followed him around the side of the house to a small garden that Emmeline tended in warmer months, now dormant for winter, but offering a measure of privacy from the bustling yard. Once out of sight of the others, Dulaine turned to her, his composure faltering for the first time. In 2 strides, he closed the distance between them, gathering her into his arms with a fierceness that stole her breath. I thought of you every mile, he murmured against her hair. Every hour, it was like a physical ache being away. Charlotte clung to him, inhaling the scent of leather and horses and the indefinable essence that was simply him. I was so afraid, she confessed, when you didn't return on time. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands framing her face. We caught them, 3 men, former soldiers turned outlaws. They'll face territorial justice. A shadow crossed his face. But it doesn't bring Peterson back. No, she agreed softly, but it brings you back, and that matters, Dulaine. More than I can express. Something vulnerable flickered in his eyes, a glimpse of the man beneath the responsibility and strength. I've spent my life believing I couldn't have this, he said quietly. That loving someone was a weakness I couldn't afford. That attachment was a luxury beyond the reach of a man who lives and dies by the land's mercy. And now, Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest. Now I think I was wrong. His thumbs traced gentle patterns on her cheeks. Because these past days, facing danger, I wasn't weaker for thinking of you waiting. I was stronger, more determined to return. More careful with the life that suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. Tears pricked at Charlotte's eyes. I've never belonged anywhere the way I belong here, she whispered. With you, it terrifies me how completely I've given my heart to this place. To you. Charlotte, he said her name like a prayer, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day, when you insisted on riding back alone rather than delay me. When you showed me a strength I never expected. I love you too, she replied, the words feeling both momentous and utterly natural, with a completeness that should frighten me but somehow doesn't. Dulaine's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that contained both tenderness and promise, his arms holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. When they finally separated, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not someday, not when things settle down, they never truly do out here. Marry me now this week before the next crisis or challenge. Be my wife, my partner in everything." "Yes," Charlotte answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." Winter came early that year, with the first heavy snow falling the day after Charlotte and Dulaine exchanged vows in the small white church in Willow Creek. The entire community turned out for the wedding, the schoolchildren forming an honor guard for their teacher, the ranch hands standing proudly in cleaned and pressed clothes to witness their boss's happiness. Emmeline wept openly as Charlotte promised to love and honor her brother for all her days, and even the normally stoic Dulaine's voice faltered as he pledged his life and protection to the woman who had transformed his world in mere months. That evening, as snow blanketed the lazy M in pristine white, Dulaine led his bride up the stairs to the master bedroom, now their bedroom. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting dancing light over the simple but comfortable furnishings. "Welcome home, Mrs. Michaels," he said softly, closing the door behind them. Charlotte turned to him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had shown her what it meant to belong truly and completely. "I've been home since the moment I arrived," she confessed. "I just didn't recognize it until you helped me see." Dulaine's arms encircled her strong and sure. "The land demands everything," he reminded her, echoing his words from their first ride together. "But it gives back in equal measure to those who love it properly." "As do you," Charlotte whispered, rising on tiptoe to meet his kiss. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the ranch in winter's embrace. But within the walls of the house that had become her home, Charlotte found only warmth, belonging, and the abiding certainty that she had found her place in the world. Beside the cowboy whose hand had claimed hers, on the ranch she would never leave.